October 1864, Nashville. A torchlight procession, thousands strong, black and white together, and the military governor of Tennessee promises that crowd he will be their Moses. He will lead them out of bondage, he says. Charles Sumner, the abolitionist senator, would later write a different name for the same man, not Moses, Pharaoh. The promise never changed. The man who made it did. Du Bois treats that turn as a key to the whole of Black Reconstruction, because he isn't telling the story of a democracy that failed. He's telling the story of a democracy that was killed, and of a killing that paid. That's the question this episode exists to answer, and the answer runs through a torchlight promise, a wage paid in something other than money, and a single encyclopedia paragraph an editor refused to print. How do you kill a working democracy and get away with it? Start with the man at the Capitol in Nashville, because everything that follows is already inside him. Andrew Johnson wasn't a planter's friend playing a part. He'd started out as the poor laborer's champion, the man who wanted the planters' vast land holdings carved apart. The poor white's answer to the aristocracy. In Nashville, he wished aloud for a Moses to lead the freed people, and the crowd of thousands answered by naming him, "You are our Moses." Du Bois preserves the scene, the shouts spreading through the crowd, the cheering rolling back off the State House walls. And Johnson accepted the part. Here's what he told them, as the record preserves it. Johnson said, quote, "Humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses, and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace." End quote. Then Lincoln's assassination made him president, with power Du Bois compares to a military dictator's. And Du Bois pauses the whole book to mark what that meant. No champion of labor had ever been handed a more splendid opportunity. So what did he do with it? On every test Du Bois tracks, he ran backward. He pardoned the planters he'd promised to break, 14,000 of them in 9 months. I keep circling back to that number because pardons aren't passive. Each one was a decision, signed. The Freedmen's Bureau bill came to his desk and he killed it. The Civil Rights Bill came, and he killed that too. The Southern states wrote the Black Codes, and he said nothing. And the land question, the one he'd built his name on, Du Bois tracks the timing. He dropped it when it became clear the beneficiaries would be black. Now, the easy story would be bribery. Du Bois doesn't frame the turn as bought. He writes that it wasn't deliberate, wasn't even a conscious wish to harm. Something older than money did the work. Du Bois wrote, quote, "Andrew Johnson could not include Negroes in any conceivable democracy. He tried to, but as a poor white, steeped in the limitations, prejudices, and ambitions of his social class, he could not. And this is the key to his career." End quote. Sit with what that sentence is claiming. It says the man's democracy had a floor, and the floor was color. His hatred of the planters was real, but Du Bois catches what the hatred was hiding, a secret admiration, an inferiority complex that flattery could reach. The aristocracy he'd raged at started arriving at the White House to flatter him, and the rage melted into service. Charles Sumner watched it happen from the Senate and wrote the epitaph in a letter. Sumner wrote, quote, "They should have had a Moses as a president, but they had found a Pharaoh." End quote. The strange part is Du Bois's verdict. It isn't treason. He calls Johnson the most pitiful figure of American history, not a man who flipped by calculation, a man flipped by caste, which is the movement's real finding. Johnson was one man, but the turn that happened in him happened to a whole class of poor white Southerners. Men whose economic interest ran right beside black labor and who chose the class above them instead. One man's flip is a biography. A class's flip needs a wage. So what was the payment? Why would poor white laborers, men receiving, in Du Bois's words, a low wage, enforce an order that kept that wage low? And before Du Bois answers, give the uncomfortable part its due, because he does. The compensation was real. If you're poor and white in the post-war South, there are doors that open for you and stay bolted for the man in the next field. That's worth something. Don't pretend it isn't. Du Bois didn't. He wrote the mechanism down in a passage so exact, it later gave David Rediger the title of his 1991 book, The Wages of Whiteness. Once you hear it, you'll see it everywhere. Du Bois wrote, quote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools." End quote. A wage paid in status instead of money. And he keeps going. The police drawn from their ranks. The courts leaning their way because they depend on their votes. Their children in the best schools the county has. None of that's imaginary. And Du Bois never says it is. The objection states itself, and it's the strongest one in the episode. If the goods were real, wasn't this just a rational bargain? Not false consciousness, a deal. And if it was a deal, freely restruck at every election, then nobody manufactured anything, and the tragedy is choice. And I'll be honest with you, if the episode stopped right here, the bargain reading would win. Deference you can feel. Schools you can walk your children to. Against that, a class alliance is an abstraction. So Du Bois doesn't answer with a sermon. He answers with arithmetic. He opens the ledger. The wage had a function, and it wasn't generosity. Keep the white worker loyal to color instead of class, and you can pay him less too, because each race now stands ready to underbid the other. Both wages pinned low. One wedge holding them there. Two groups of workers whose interests, he says, were all but the same, taught to hate and fear each other more deeply than any pair of workforces on earth. I can't think of a stranger achievement of deliberate politics. Built, emphasized, kept in repair. So long as the white laborer chose poverty over standing equal with the black one, no Southern labor movement could exist. And the arrangement eventually wrote its own audit. In 1933, while Du Bois was finishing this book, the editor of the Macon Telegraph in Georgia looked back across 7 decades and conceded the whole mechanism in print, in the first person plural. The South had held the Negro back to keep him poor, and keeping him poor had thrown him into competition with white workers and kept them poor too. Nearly 70 years late, the receipt arrived. So the executioners were paid in a currency far cheaper than equal wages would have been. Payment secured. Now watch how the actual taking was done. And pay attention to the story that gets told about it, because the textbooks canonize that story. Here's the reading the textbooks canonized, and I want to state it at full strength before I test it, because it is not a stupid story. Reconstruction fell because it failed. The familiar apologetic version stacks its counts. The finances were chaotic. The governing coalition young and divided. the North tired. And, as that version likes to put it, no republic keeps an army in its own provinces forever. And the kernel is real. Du Bois concedes the graft outright. Bribery of black legislators he calls widespread. An era so crooked that, Du Bois notes, New York's Tweed ring alone stole something like $75 million. He just adds the detail the apologetic version leaves out. The big thieves, he shows, were always white men. Stack all that up, and you get a government that might have died of its own weight no matter who pushed. If that version holds, the terror was just weather, ugly but incidental, and this episode has no case. Du Bois doesn't argue the adjectives. He pulls the account books, and they say the opposite of failure. Cotton stood at about 3 million bales in 1870, after the wartime collapse. Under free labor, it came all the way back, 5.7 million bales by 1880, past the 1860 slave labor peak. The constitutions those governments wrote were so far from incompetent that the white governments who overthrew them kept living under them. South Carolina's for 27 years, Virginia's for 32. Mississippi works like a control case here. Black political power ran strongest there, and Mississippi added no state debt at all because landholders and black citizens alike refused to endorse the railroad credit schemes that sank other states. None of that makes these governments saints, and Du Bois doesn't need saints, only proof they weren't dying. That's all working means here: production up, constitutions kept, debt held. And one detail belongs in a frame on the wall. When the self-declared reformers took the states back, almost no theft indictments followed against the thieves they'd campaigned on. The prosecutions just did not come. Du Bois reads that absence as the tell. You don't decline to prosecute a crime wave you believe in. You decline to prosecute a pretext. So if failure wasn't the trigger, what was? Du Bois puts it in one sentence, and it's not the sentence you were taught. He wrote, quote, "The South was impelled to brute force and deliberate deception in dealing with the Negro because it had been astonished and disappointed, not by the Negro's failure, but by his success and promise of greater success." End quote. Success. That's the trigger. And the method had two halves, one loud, one quiet. The loud half was terror as administration. The Klan wasn't a mood. It was the poor whites' negotiated role in the settlement. It's dirty work, in Du Bois's phrase, the work assigned to the men being paid in status. And it wasn't alone. The record carries other names: the White League, the Knights of the White Camellia, and it left a record trail. St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, fall of 1868. The rolls carry a Republican majority above 1,000. Then, over 2 days and nights, the Klan kills or wounds more than 200 Republicans there. On Election Day, Grant receives not one vote. Not one. The Democratic ticket polls nearly 4,800, and survivors are marked with red flannel badges, enrolled in Democratic clubs, and made to vote under them. 8 years later, South Carolina's campaign planners put instructions in writing for their clubs, and the document's logic, preserved in the Ku Klux investigation records, was that threatening an opponent leaves a problem behind and killing him doesn't. That isn't rage. That's procedure. The quiet half wore robes of a different kind. The Supreme Court, in the Reese and Cruikshank decisions, gutted the federal laws written to protect black voters. Then, the bargain of 1876, what history calls the Compromise of 1877, finished it. The disputed Hayes and Tilden election was settled, and the price of settlement was that the Army went home. And here is where the version you sat with at the top of this movement gets its answer. The claim was that a government which cannot defend itself is doomed, regardless of who pushes. Du Bois accepts the premise and shows what it actually proves. He wrote, quote, "Negro suffrage failed because it was overthrown by brute force. Even if it had been the best government on earth, force, exercised by a majority of richer, more intelligent, and more experienced men, could have overthrown it." End quote. Survivability under armed overthrow is not a test any democracy passes. Yours wouldn't either. And once the protectors left, the South was driven, in Du Bois's phrase, back toward slavery. Convict lease, prisoners leased out for private profit. Georgia's lessees paid $25,000 a year and kept the labor as clear gain. Debt peonage on the federal government's own record by 1908. The vote strangled by understanding clauses and all-white primaries. And school money split at 2 to 10 times per white child what the black child got. Du Bois titles this chapter Back Toward Slavery. And here's a margin note of my own about that road. It ran beside a constitutional carve-out, the punishment exception in the 13th Amendment, the clause that lets involuntary servitude survive as a criminal sentence. Some state constitutions preserve their own versions of that carve-out. And if it sounds like a dead letter, it isn't. In November 2022, voters in Alabama, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont were still removing language permitting slavery or involuntary servitude as punishment for crime from their state constitutions. And a similar measure in Louisiana failed after its own sponsor urged a no vote over the wording. The carve-out has outlived everyone who wrote it. So the taking was force plus abandonment, and the trigger was success. But notice something. All of it was documented while it happened. Investigation records, election returns, debt ledgers. Which leaves the strangest question in the whole story. Why did none of it reach you? Because the record wasn't lost. It was handled. Du Bois ends the book with a chapter called The Propaganda of History, and it reads like an evidence log. The emancipated slave, the chief witness to the whole period, was shut out of the court of history, his testimony dismissed on sight. The records themselves were attacked. In Florida, the papers of Jonathan Gibbs, the black superintendent who effectively built the state's public schools, were destroyed. Alabama, Du Bois reports, tried to obliterate the printed record of Reconstruction outright. And when the account couldn't be destroyed, it was edited. In 1929, the Encyclopedia Britannica commissioned an article from Du Bois, then cut every reference to Reconstruction from it. He offered them a single paragraph as his price for staying. One paragraph. He put his objection in it and dared them to print it. Du Bois wrote, quote, "White historians have ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption. But the Negro insists that it was Negro loyalty and the Negro vote alone that restored the South to the Union, established the new democracy, both for white and black, and instituted the public schools." End quote. The editor called the article excellent and refused the paragraph. So Du Bois refused to let the article appear at all. Hold on to that scene, because it cuts both ways. And before we're done, I'll ask whether the man in it should be trusted either. Above the destroyed files and the edited entries stood the universities, where the acquittal of the counter-revolution was written up as scholarship and handed down into the textbooks. And Du Bois cites a survey of what those textbooks actually taught. He names the schools, Columbia and Johns Hopkins particularly. He names the men. And then he offers the single fact that he says explains them all. It fits in 6 words. He wrote, quote, they cannot conceive Negroes as men, end quote. That's the whole machine in one clause. The instinct here is to reach for conspiracy, and the sentence is telling you something quieter and worse. A historian who cannot conceive the witness as a man doesn't need a conspiracy. Every document sorts itself. And before you file this under settled history, notice that the argument over who controls the national story isn't archival. In March 2025, the White House issued an executive order under which what it called improper ideology was to be removed from Smithsonian properties. The American Historical Association answered that the order egregiously misrepresents the Smithsonian's work. And by July 2026, a follow-up White House report was pressing the charge at the institution's leadership as a radical view of American history. Wherever you land on that fight, its shape, a government, a museum, and a contest over which version of American history gets displayed, is the contest Du Bois watched the universities settle in his day. Who decides which record reaches the public? And that closes the spine. The land was denied first. Then the ballot was taken. Then the story. Getting away with it means writing the autopsy. Answer the question. How do you kill a working democracy and get away with it? You recruit its natural allies with the wage of status instead of money. You take it by force at the exact moment its success becomes intolerable. And then you write the history yourself, so thoroughly that 91 years after Du Bois printed the contrary record, it can still sound like a conspiracy theory. That answer is falsifiable, and I want you to test it. If these governments were collapsing on their own, the audit should show simple collapse. It shows the opposite on concrete counts: production, constitutions, debt. And if the profession had been neutral, destroyed and barred, and edited records would have been treated as evidence of something. Instead, they were inherited as a verdict. But before the case closes, Du Bois hands you one last contradiction, aimed at himself. He demands history as science, facts set down with utter disregard for what anyone wishes were true. And in the same chapter, he tells you he writes as a Negro who can't help believing in the humanity of his people. In a field, his words, devastated by passion and belief. If history written by winners is a weapon, then by that standard, this book is one too. That's my inference, not his sentence, but he leaves it wide open because he refuses to hide his position and prints it instead. The difference he stakes everything on is that his side of the ledger is signed. Whether a declared bias can do what a hidden one can't, that part he leaves to you. A signed indictment is still an indictment written by the plaintiff. He closes the book at full scale, calling this story the grandest drama 1,000 years of history has staged. 10 million people carried out of Africa and down into hell, who rose again in his image and made the boldest bid the world had yet seen to win democracy for the people who work. Then he calls the attempt a failure and corrects himself in the same breath. A splendid one, because the collapse never arrived where the mockers had predicted it. If he's right, every account of this period that begins from Black incapacity isn't a verdict on the case. It's evidence in it. If the wage was just a bargain, freely rechosen, the argument breaks. But the menu had one surviving option once the terror finished its work, and the receipt came back signed, Macon, Georgia, 1933. By keeping him poor, we kept ourselves poor. And the torchlight crowd in Nashville, they never got their Moses. What they got, 70 years on, was a witness. Read the last chapter and check the arithmetic yourself. It's been waiting more than 90 years for you to audit it.